Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm back from my trade show in Barcelona, and for the first time in like 3 or 4 months, I have a little room to breathe, which is nice. It's just been one thing after another for me with work, my dad's health, my health, the podcast, and various and sundry items we'll just describe as life. And when I say work, there's an awful lot of things that subdivide into that. But anyway, with a big trade show in Spain behind me, plus a few episodes of the show already recorded, I can decompress a little. Now, Barcelona was fantastic. Amy and I spent 3 days sightseeing, getting in 8 or 9 miles of walking each day. And we did a tour of the Sagrada Familia, which I wrote about in the newsletter that I do. That was pretty mind-blowing. And after that, I had 3 days of a gigantic pharma trade show, and things went pretty well for me there. Came out of that with a couple of new members of my trade association, caught up with a lot of companies, and made some prospects, and did a couple of panels while I was there, which, is my thing. But I didn't bring any podcast gear with me. I pre-recorded that week's show intro before I left. So it was also kind of nice not having the show going on in my head. Now, one funny / infuriating thing that happened going into this trip is that our accommodations for Barcelona, I'll just say, fell through the day before we flew out there. So Thursday of that week, I was scrambling to find us somewhere to stay. Went to the conference site and looked at their hotel bookings, found a neat hotel, jumped to that one, to their site just to see if I get it cheaper, because that's my thing. And that's how we ended up at the Hotel Miramar, which is up on Mount Juic, this big, we'll say, hill that overlooks Porto Vell and the sea, and gets you a view of just about the entire city if you go to another angle of the hotel. It was a little pricey, but not as bad as I feared when I started my hotel search. And the area was really fantastic. These gardens behind it, other things were accessible, like the Miro Museum and the the Estadio, the Museum for the Barcelona 1992 Olympics, and other stuff. Anyway, the upside was being so isolated up on this big hill was great for being able to get to sleep, because there was no one around. There were no streets outside. There weren't people reveling and partying. The downside is it made it a little difficult trying to find a taxi in the morning to get to the Fira, to the big trade show location. But I managed, along with a few other attendees who were staying there. Basically, we'd step outside, realize there were no cabs. We all could recognize that we were going to the same place, and just start walking and basically carjack taxis. Anyway, that's nothing illegal necessarily. We got there, we got back, and, for any hassles that happened, like the taxi, getting a taxi there, the taxi lines leaving the show, the metro, the restaurant service, passport control, gigantic lines. As I told people during the show itself, griping about the difficulties of our business trip to Barcelona is really not a great look. So I'm going to keep that to a minimum and just say it was a really great week overall. Amy got to do a bunch of stuff while I was at the trade show. We had a really good time, and next year it's in Milan. I'm thinking of doing the opposite thing. I'd go in like the day before the show, and then after the conference, go off and either sightsee there, or maybe finally get to Rome, which is something I've always wanted to do. Anyway, we'll see. What I'm saying is, good week. I was pretty tired by the time I got home. The day after getting in, I wanted to and did host a live talk with Patrick McDonnell, who was on the show very recently. It was around his new book, The Superhero's Journey, and I went down to Princeton. Amy came along, did this live show with Patrick and a nice audience. Got to hang out with various listeners and friends, and past podcast Everett Glenn, or E.S. Glenn, came to join us. Anyway, it was one of those things where had I thought about the jet lag thing, I probably wouldn't have committed, but did it anyway and had a wonderful time. Now I'm ready to get back to things. So this week's conversation that you're about to listen to is one that I recorded back in the middle of that really hectic phase. I've recorded this one almost 2 months ago. My guest is the cartoonist Josh Baer. We sat down during the Small Press Expo, or SPX, in Bethesda, Maryland in early September to talk about his new graphic novel / memoir, Unended. It's from Uncivilized Books. Unended it's a tough book, but one that really resonated with me. If there's an elevator pitch, it's simple. Josh's stand-in character finds a manuscript of an incomplete play by his late father that his old man had written over a couple of decades, and he wants to adapt it into a comic. And that is what it's about, but it's about so much more than that. It is an exploration of family trauma, of memory, of art, and its maybe not redemptive nature. Now that I describe it that way, it kind of sounds like it's a companion to Dan Clowes's new book, Monica, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But they're very different books in style and approach. Still, those themes kind of hold up, whether it's fiction in Clowes's case or memoir in Josh's new book, or nonfiction, we'll say, although Josh's work, Josh's publisher, Uncivilized Books, has a description of Unended that includes this sentence: Baer's inky line, tangled textures, and kaleidoscopic color boldly fuse on the page into comic book semiotics, flights of grandeur, and tangents inside tangents. I'm not sure I can come up with a better description exactly for what awaits you in Unended. And there's this murkiness to the visuals that kind of mirrors we'll say the ugly memories that Josh is conjuring. And there's a fragmented nature to the story and a surrealism in a way that the pages themselves kind of capture that sense of not being able to look too closely at ourselves and at the things that shaped us, if you get me. I'm going to say I didn't conventionally enjoy, in air quotes, reading Unended, but I'm glad I did. Like I say, it resonated with me, even though we grew up in very different circumstances. Josh's book carries that sense of the unresolved and the unresolvable, and the ways in which we try to make sense of the past and write a better future for ourselves. And he does it in a really compelling graphic style. So go check out Josh Baer's Unended from Uncivilized Books. I'm putting this one out a week before the book comes out, but by the time you listen to it, it'll be in stores. Now, I should also warn you, just like in this intro, I do a lot of gabbing in this episode. I was in a state of exhaustion at this point at the Small Press Expo when we recorded. It was 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. I had stayed up until at least 1 a.m. on Friday and Saturday nights, which is way past my bedtime. And I was in Mr. Wonderful mode throughout, being social and pushing all these conversations with people. I also started the trip Thursday afternoon by driving 7 hours down to Charlottesville, and did that so I could see a friend of mine who was dying of a brain tumor. So that started off the weekend for me in a particularly fraught state. I was occluded by the shadow, as I've been calling it of late, this sense of death that's been lurking, and that was one of the sort of darkest points for me, although one in which I found great sense of community at SPX and lots of people I could share my experience with and theirs, and just through talking kind of find something more. So I may say some stuff in this episode that you haven't heard before, and I may be more jangly and kind of nervous laughing and cutting off the speaker in ways that you haven't heard me do either. I was in a rough state. You'll get that. I think it was great, though, to have Josh, of all people, as my guest at that moment, with a book of his that really forced me into a contemplation of mortality, of my own family situation, especially my unresolved issues with my old man, and how you make art out of that. Anyway, as other caveats go, there is a break in the middle when Josh needed coffee. Also, when he refers to Hyena, that's his partner, Hyena Hell, who's also a cartoonist. And there's this subtle beeping static that comes up in the background. That was one of our watches or phones, Bluetooth, causing interference, I guess. Haven't had that happen in a million years, but it's not particularly noticeable, just noticeable to me because that's my thing. Anyway, here's Josh's bio from the book. Josh Baer is a graphic novelist and educator living in New York City. He is the author of Theth, Tomorrow Forever, Abysmalation, and Raw Power. He describes his work as a mix of biographical fiction and punk anti-narrative. He teaches comics at schools all over New York City and in private classes. His new book is Unended. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Josh Baer. I know it's an odd question to phrase, but where did Unended begin, and how did it evolve into? It's two questions. How did it evolve into an ending? I found my dad. My whole time I was growing up would make these kind of vague references to the great American novel that he wanted to write, and I never really knew what that meant. And I didn't know he had a relationship with writing, though he would, talk about himself as a writer every now and then. I'm trying to think of the right word. It's I can't think of it. Vague. What's another word for vague that people make? Ambiguous, ambivalent. He has another word. But anyways, he, so surprisingly, I found a manuscript after he passed away. My brothers and I were at his home, and boxes presented to us of his writing. There's a bunch of complete pieces that were very short, and then this ambitious play that he had written. And it's clear when you see it that he was writing it at different eras. Like some of it's on typing paper, and then there's a big period where it was left alone, and then he must have dusted it off and re-engaged with it when he retired. So the late 90s, he's writing again. Now it's on computer font, but he had really, frankly deteriorated as a writer. He had, the original acts of the play were actually really well structured in a lot of ways. And I know that with comics, you see what happens to artists who are really muscular style. Yeah, you see the first chapter or two are really, in most long form comics, are really detailed and thought out. By the end, everything's getting looser and looser as they're trying to hit a deadline. But anyway, I'm sorry. That's just my experience of many times. Yeah, but I mean more of like artists who have a regular grind, and then they take a break, and you're like, oh, X is like a wonderful artist, and you see their late era work. I think Chris Ware once said that he was horrified to see that Frank King's stuff looked like he had forgotten how to draw. Yeah, like years after he was no longer doing it regularly. So maybe something similar happened. But I also think my dad kind of drifted away from kind of the same relationship he had with his feelings. It just he wasn't as interested in really making himself vulnerable, and became kind of like the last part of the play is a bit of a straw man argument. If the way you portray it is very venomous, and to me it felt like an older man getting angrier and angrier about the narrowing of his life.
Yeah.
But I don't want to ascribe your father's feelings to you, but
well, it's always interesting when I get interviewed because I drew this stuff. I lived with this book for the last 5 years. I finished it in January, and I'm already on to my next project. So when people read it and it's fresh to them, it's very interesting. Yeah. It's a time machine. Yeah. So like you're responding to something that I've looked at.
And processed, yeah.
I processed and looked at 1,000 times. And anyway, so found this play and I felt entitled to adapt it. I'm in it. So I took it upon myself to start adapting it. And then my dad's play is about 40 pages long, or there's 50 pages of comics, and my book is 270 something. So all of the stuff around it is, me dealing with how do you resolve a play that doesn't have an ending, because it was so ragged at the end, both emotionally, like you're saying, had this tone of like you said, of a raging, resentful person. And it also just, with the pages I had, would have scribbled out sentences and different endings. I mean, I kind of, reading in between the lines, I could see like why, I think he had one ending in mind, while in the 70s, my mother had died. She died in 74, and he was dealing with this as like a widower. And, years later, he had a new family, he had a second wife. And I think originally his vision of the play was that he was going to go off into the afterlife with my mother. And then you can see in the play, he's trying to kind of compromise that into a new vision that isn't kind of disloyal to the life he has now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on, a lot to unpack, as they say. So I had this play, and I got this idea to adapt it. And then I'm like, well, I'm stuck because I don't have an ending. And then I decided to make the lack of an ending a feature instead of a bug, and call the book Unended.
Yeah. It puts me in mind, at the time, it put me in mind of Synecdoche, New York, the movie I'm blanking on the Charlie Kaufman.
Yeah.
And of course, now it puts me in mind also of Adaptation by Charlie Kaufman and Spike Jonze, where the whole process of it is, what the hell do I do with this unadaptable piece of work?
Right.
In your case, there's so much more feeding in before the play adaptation proper begins. So much laying of groundwork in terms of who you are and what the family dynamic is, that prepares us for what this piece of art is going to be. It's to me, it's fascinating, and I wondered for you, knowing how autobiography or autobio leaks into a lot of your work, how naked you felt, I guess, in the process of this one in particular. More revealing than you've felt in the past, or a different kind of?
That's a really good question. I mean, I definitely, I would have to put it next to my previous book. But I think this book is better. I don't know if it's more revealing, but I guess it does go to another level. I mean, the Tomorrow Forever was really very much a biographical book, and it's this stand-in character theft that I have for me. So I have an avatar, but it's, other than that, it's very much my life, and it was my life during a period that was very vulnerable, a period where I was so dysfunctional and couldn't work and couldn't really function with people and friends and girlfriends and a community. And I couldn't do comics, which was the big crux of that book. So this book is very much like 10 years later, that theft character in his 30s or 40s actually. And 20 years later, and while it's not about him, it is very much like where that person was going. And I don't have an avatar though. So you probably saw in the book that my face is constantly blacked out.
Yeah.
Because when you're telling a story about yourself, you're always shaving off elements. You're always embellishing and not being aware of it. It's never true. No matter, you can't even try. Our memories are, prone to like invention and conflation. And, so Yeah, I'd have to take it on a page by page level. I know there were pages where I was really happy with the tones and the notes that I was hitting, like somebody like finding a string on a guitar progression.
Yeah.
And I'm always searching for a way to say a certain truth. I'm very inspired by a lot of very emotional punk rock that I grew up on. And when I'm writing a page, I'm trying to think about how to be truthful. I'm using that as a bit of a weather vane for where to go, because a lot of punk rock showed me that you could be embarrassing without being cringe. You could be, you could make like you said, invulnerable, but you could be vulnerable and still be very defiant. You can be vulnerable and still be very inspiring, and that's, in fact, making work sometimes builds up my spirit a lot. So things that I otherwise maybe would feel crushed by in life are actually almost sources of strength.
Talk about the punk influence on the visuals themselves, because you've got a style that is, as your bio has the punk anti-narrative in joshbayer.com description, but that kinetic, I don't want to say garish, it's or muddy. It's a weird, well, describe your visual style and how you employ it in this.
All those words, from muddy and garish to the other words you use, poetic and
hyperkinetic too. But yeah,
I'll take all of that.
Yeah.
It really is what it is. The work turns out in a way other than you plan. Just like this conversation, it's like, to a certain degree, it's got its own life. So I'm happy when people feel, they respond to my work. It hits a chord in them. But I don't know what I'm doing, which is ironic, because when I teach, I'm all about showing students a system,
right.
And usually it's like, and some of the systems I use, but I'm using them to get to pull me out of this deep, like kind of mud. It's easy when I'm doing comics to really slide into the weeds, and I'm using system to pull myself out of the weeds. And but I have to kind of ride out like what my brain is doing, what my weird like ADD like storm of different impulses is doing, and it often I'll do good work, I'll overwork it, I'll correct the overwork, and go back and forth between those poles. So it is that's the way reason it looks the way it does.
Yeah.
But influences definitely, and I'm always trying. I think part of the punk rock thing is not wanting to be part of the mainstream society, so I'm pulling from older shit, which is outside of the current commercial popular climate. It's very ironic that I'm teaching at SVA, because I'll have students who are so influenced by slickness and this kind of Disneyfication at the worst. And at other times they're doing stuff which is classically, aesthetically part of a shared language. But I definitely wanted to, it appeals to me to look at Cliff Starrett, to look at Bud Fisher, to look at who's somebody else. I want to say Kniff. I'm trying to think of somebody more. Tony DeZungia. They're not exactly 2023 artists.
That's a good one. I like that. Our 1970s callbacks. That's good with Tony.
Oh yeah, I got more than a few of them.
Yeah.
And 1970s callbacks, 1980s callbacks. I'll look at Pettibone. I'll look at Sean. Anyways, I'll look at other punk artists, and I'll try to pull out stuff for myself.
Mm-hmm. And you studied at SVA, but a little later in your, we'll say, career.
Oh, my life, yeah.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it, because you're about my age, but I was reading.
But my career as a cartoonist hadn't started yet. I started after SVA.
Right. So you went to SVA in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
So you would have been
33. I was 33 or 34 when I came in. 34.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was that like? I mean, were students generally younger than you? Was it a weird dynamic learning?
No, I mean, because I I was alienated from the student body for other reasons.
Yeah,
you know?
that's a given with us. So
right, it's a lot. At that time, it was a lot of. There's a few people that we recognized like a shared aesthetic in each other, and there's a lot of those even it didn't get along. A lot of hipster weirdos didn't get along with me, and I didn't get along with them. A lot of like the kind of video game playing, anime mega fans, I didn't get along with them or really have a lot in common with them. I got along with my teachers though.
Yeah.
And I was the same age as my teachers.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because you mentioned Tom Hart.
We're the same age.
That's the thing. Yeah, he's right in that same bracket. So
yeah, Matt Madden, I think, is my age, or maybe Nick Bertozzi is my age. So that was nice because I was able to forge a connection with a lot of those figures, and they encouraged me to think outside the school. Nick, I think, was the first person who told me to print out my thesis. My junior thesis was about Bob Dylan's conversion to Christianity. Mm-hmm. And, again, I think the teachers it was refreshing for them to have, to have my work.
Yeah.
That's not, but I'm sure
but yeah, the idea of an older, or we'll say more mature, quote unquote, perspective on life than an 18 or 19-year-old. Yeah.
And they're incredibly encouraging. I don't think I ever would have thought that book was successful if it wasn't for them telling me that it was successful whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyways, that's what it was like. I was 34. The reason I went to school late had to do with my ADD. I was so dysfunctional in my 20s. I couldn't handle like classes. I took a community college class when I was 24, and I could not I did some good work in there, but I really couldn't finish the homeworks. And I think I took 3 classes and dropped them all. But then I got on Wellbutrin when I was like 28.
I was going to ask what changed. Was it primarily medicinal that helped fix things?
Okay. Yeah, I was in therapy, and my therapist actually had such a my upbringing was like so dysfunctional that a lot of therapists, I think they'll have their patients write a letter to people from the past. So I was supposed to write this letter to my dad, and I think most people, it's like a page or 2, and mine, I spent like 9 months on it. It was like 50 pages. But I couldn't, to get the letter done, that's when she first discovered I had ADD, because I would say I'm trying to collect my thoughts, and I just end up with all these scraps of paper just spread across the floor, and I don't know how to tie them together. And she's like, well, it sounds like you're describing ADD. So I got on meds for it to finish that letter, that therapy homework. And then I slowly started to put the building blocks together that allowed me to, function in an adult life. Yeah. I got my license. I went back to school. And that led to where I am now. But I wasn't able to do it back then, and it was a relief. Like the first thing I did is I was in LA, and I went to UCLA night classes, and I took an art history course. And the art history course, I had to memorize, I did the math once, it's like 268 factoids to get a good grade on the exam. Cause you had to know, identify a painting and know the movement, the title, the artist, the year, and the movement, title, artist, year, and maybe one other fact about it. And so I made these flashcards. I photocopied from the book, and I put together flashcards, and I'd go to like Jerry's Deli every night, and I would like quiz myself until I knew all the answers. And that was so satisfying. And in fact, it really sticks out to me that like when I teach students now, in the back of my head, I'm always like, it would be better if college was structured so that you could do 2 classes a semester for 8 years instead of 4 classes a semester for 4 years. Yeah. Because you can't completely commit.
Oh God. The reading we did back then in my college years, I'm like, yeah, we've read Anna Karenina in 2 weeks. Sure. While we were doing 3 other classes, that's kind of nuts. But this is what at 18, 19, 20, apparently we have the energy to do that.
Did you really do that?
Allegedly. I
would
mean,
have
you
died.
read it. Well, that's the realization that a lot of these things are 18, 19, 20 is not the age to be engaging in some of these things, or to understand that you're going to have to re-engage these books as you get, further along in life. And that's only if you pursue the arts in any way, shape, or form in college. I guess with other more technical stuff, the brain is young and flexible enough to handle, science or whatever. But yeah, I look at things, I hear older pals of mine have stories of, like 3,000 pages of reading in a week for some, class or another. I'm like, yeah, we could fake it, or we could garner up that or rustle up the energy to do these things. Wow. But how much do we really hold on to? At the same time, I do 50 of these a year plus, and I do not retain enough of, the guests who I'm reading on a regular basis, because I've got to make this show every week, because I have my techniques and tips for how to function in the world when I'm completely scattered too. So
do you feel like you have ADD as well?
I don't know. I read many years ago someone who wrote the line, I stay incredibly busy so that people won't realize how incredibly lazy I am. Oh. And I think that's part of it. I mean, everybody thinks I'm super functional, but, deep down I feel like, of course, I haven't done enough, and I'm half-assing my way through everything in this world. But to the rest of you, I seem like I have my shit together. So I'll keep faking it, and nobody will actually listen to this part of the show. So
you're going to edit it out, or you think?
No, I'll just leave it in, because everybody, Gil's talking, just let that go. But I want to hear what Josh has to say. But
oh, please.
But that discovery of your father's writing, that sense of, it's something I talk about with guests a lot, that sense of art and legacy. And what you leave behind. In his case, having kids who, as you convey it, were damaged by your upbringing and your family life. Any kids of your own?
Oh, no.
Okay, I assumed, but same thing. And I always tell people, by the way, when they ask about the real keys to productivity, I think you have the same, 2 of the 3 at least, same as me.
Childlessness.
No social life. I don't drink, and I don't have kids. And I think you're at least 2 of the 3. I don't know if you have a social life or not, but
right.
Yeah, it really helps to just not have any human contact and just keep doing your thing. But the sense of making this art, this book in particular, and your body of work, and that sense of legacy, I guess.
Yeah.
Now knowing that, your father had left something behind, not necessarily for you, but that he was trying to create something.
Yeah. He left behind his struggle.
Yeah.
A record of his struggle to be an artist.
And do you see that in yourself?
I see a reaction against that.
Yeah.
And, I also have empathy. I don't think I've communicated too much empathy for my dad so far, but I have empathy for him for raising kids and raising kids and failing at being a writer. I think is different. I think it would have a hard time, like you said, doing any of the things that I love if I did have a social life and I did have kids. And, I forget what the third.
Drinking, which, I don't know if that's how long-term a thing that is for you, but it's been over 10 years for me, and it's just I
hate drinking.
Yeah.
I've never liked it. And I have kind of a love-hate relationship with straight edge. I just am numbed by how stupid so much straight edge music is. And even people who kind of use straight edge as I've never met them. I just read about them. I've met very few straight edge people who are older than like 19, and honestly, I haven't met any since like 1992. But I follow like the straight edge page on Instagram, and I'm always sending like their terrible memes to my girlfriend. But I am straight edge at the same time.
But there's living straight edge, and then there's proselytizing. For me, it's just my urologist said, quit booze, caffeine, and spicy food, and I laughed at him, and then I thought, of the 3, which could I try to get by without? And I stopped drinking in one day, and I was like, apparently this is fine. I haven't had a symptom for the reason I went to the urologist. I can keep going with caffeine. My wife is Cajun, so I can stick with the spicy food.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, I just stopped drinking booze and then discovered, oh, wow, I get a couple extra hours. I never feel hungover. And as I always say, the rest of you grow more boring with every fucking minute that goes by. But otherwise, it's really tremendous.
Yeah.
But it really has been one of those Oh, okay. If you don't have that factor, you don't have excuses to make shitty decisions. You don't feel run down the next
fuck
day.
me. If I had been a drinker with my poor impulse control,
Yeah.
so many dumb things I would have done. I've talked about that with my partner as well. Like, yeah, I mean, you hear, so...
We're at a festival and people have done dumb shit this weekend.
Exactly.
I know
I'm
people have
embarrassing
done dumb
enough.
stuff. And, yeah.
So but yeah, what you just said about get a couple more hours in, that's important. People out there, cram those hours in to get work done. When I go to Rutgers to teach, that's 2 hours a day on the commute that I get to draw. The Rutgers train, the New Jersey Transit, compared to a lot of trains, is very smooth, by the way.
Yeah.
So, those hours really count. Getting a half hour in a day is great because that's going to lead to you doing one day at least. That half hour will turn into several hours.
Hey, do you get a regular practice at making comics and art, or does the teaching schedule kind of create too many hiccups or hurdles for you to...
No, I do. I get it regular. The beginning of the semester traditionally has been a bit of a transition. Mm-hmm. So it's like I'll have to put the comics aside and I can't get regimented because I'm writing I have a bunch of syllabuses to write and I have to dot a lot of I's and cross T's. But then middle semester, sure, it can be workable. I had more of a crammed schedule last year. I just took a single class off my schedule. And right now I have Monday nights, Wednesday nights, and Saturday nights like free. And that's amazing. That's a lot of potential hours. So as long as the hardest part is you can easily have a day off and you spend from 9 a.m. till 1 p.m. you're writing emails.
Goofing on social media.
Or you go through on social media, wasting time. Yeah. Or then you got to eat. Then you got to wash your dishes. Then you got to do some other chore. And there's always something. And then all of a sudden it's 6 o'clock at night. And then you eat again. And then it's 7 or 8. And so lots of times I'll have a day off and I don't get my day started until 9. And that's the biggest thing. It chews up work. Going back to my dad, though, I think that it would be very hard to do any of these things, to have all of that to do, all of the day-to-day of just keeping the machine running of your life and have kids as well. I can see how it slipped away from him, this dream of being a writer.
I'll say as we'll say abusive, emotionally abusive, etc., as your father comes off in the book, it seems to be not inspired by circumstance, but it feels more like the overwhelmingness of your mother's death and having 3 kids, as opposed to he is a horrible person who started out as a horrible person who treated his kids poorly. It feels more like a response or an overwhelmedness on his part, the way you depict him. And I don't know if that captures how you felt about your dad and how your feelings about your father changed over the course of this book in particular. Whether you felt whether you had a catharsis, whether your understanding of your father changed in the process of making Unended.
Right. That's a good question. That's
like 4 good questions in one, but go on.
It is. I have like 4 different responses. Because for one thing, that's a big question. Like, did this person change because of trauma? Because I ask myself of people a lot, I see like people who've we were talking when I came in today about people who suffered the death of a spouse, and you see how that changes them in all kinds of ways that aren't pretty. I heard Bill Griffith in your interview talking about how much anger he had after his partner died, and I don't know what Bill Griffith was like 20 years ago, though, So, my dad, a little bit column A, a little bit column B. I think definitely the traumas of my mother dying made him worse. But there's a lot of evidence that, my mom had a friend who was like her best friend who told us, like, I was not happy about her marrying your dad, Okay. Yeah. She was like, I was always like, I didn't know about this guy. And he so yeah, you know, my dad has different sides though. Talk to his stepchildren and they adore him. He was like this great dad to them. Talk to my brothers is a different story. So,
did you talk to them in the course of this book?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
They were very supportive.
I thought so. It feels like they not contributed, but that they added to the fullness of it.
They really did. There's actually a scene that I think I mentioned this on another podcast.
There are no other podcasts. Sorry, go on.
There's one scene that I took out where I just couldn't fit it in. Where my brother Dan and John and I were having lunch, and we were talking about me acquiring the play, and I remembered that it was given to us, and they were like, "No, we just took it." And Hyena told me that she wished I'd left it in because it speaks to one of the themes about the unreliability of narrative and of memory, and they were really supportive, and I was nervous about it. You don't have control over your image when somebody else is telling a story about you. And my brother John was the first person who just said, very pro art statement. He said, the way you put it down is the way it is. I'm not going to try to control how you depict me. So I've seen to him, you know, fist fighting my dad and, you know, being like a growing teenager, and he was completely like cool with it. And he gave me art that I put in there, as you saw. And my brother Sam did the same thing. The page that's at the very beginning of the book of a figure falling into a volcano, he actually did that while, like, I have the book he did. It's a 25-page comic he did when he was 13. And it says in the first couple pages, drawn September 1974 to December 74. My mom died in August. So he's a kid who's like dealing with the trauma by throwing himself into a project, which is pretty key to the themes of my book.
And you have that one, we'll say chapter, you have sort of chapters in the book, at least. You have these splashes of major text where as you put it, your family is defined by suppressed creativity. But it seems like there's an awful lot. I mean, the way you define suppressed is, you know, the anger your father has or the neglect he has towards your work. But it seems that everybody was trying to make something, you know, that you still had a family that kept trying to pursue these creations, even as your father was doing this behind the scenes. He was busy writing himself. When did you come out from that suppression, I guess? You know, what was the point at which you started to feel like you had a voice and it didn't matter to get that validation?
It's a messy trail. It's
How do you become who you become?
I mean, a real core component, me becoming obsessed with being a cartoonist, was that my parents, like, they prohibited me from doing comics or reading them. And I think there was like some years where they were really policing me, you know. They didn't want me, all the things I might have done on my own, imaginative comics where like ninjas are lopping each other's heads off, like, it's pretty normal for a kid that age.
You and I being raised on Frank Miller's Daredevil. Yeah,
right. would have, I mean, it was like the Satanic Panic era. And I feel like there was a lot of that kind of weird Puritanism in my house, which was weird. My dad was like, my dad had that side, but he was just kind of angry at everything. But my stepmother, like, you know, was from a different background, and you know, they both considered themselves to be Democrats, but they were also very like,
there's left-wing Puritanism too.
Exactly.
It's not. Yeah.
So they like, I think that maybe, like, you know, my parents, like, first they sent me away to this home for troubled teens for like a year when I was like 14 to 15. And then when I got out, my dad was like, you're here to follow rules and get grades in school and get a job, and that's it. And go keep your nose clean till you get out of my house. And you're not, and I was still not allowed to draw comics. But by the time you're 16, 17, you kind of get the sense of maybe not watching you anymore. So I started to fuck around with comics some more. And then I remember I was almost 18 and I'd seen like Mark Bayer, and I did a kind of a cubist looking, not cubist, but like a flat shape folk arty, like alternative comic. And people had heads like triangles and stuff. And then I did another one when I got out, and I was like, I'm here, I can do all these weird comics. But I hit something happened with combination. I went to art school for a year in '88, and something about having all these rules are presented and having this voice in my head that was said, well, when you go to school, they're not going to be pro comics, but you just have to keep on saying fuck them. But it's a little bit like saying don't think of
the white horse. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I dropped out of school, I didn't go my sophomore year, and I just collapsed with my comics. I started doubting them. I remember I was and I was also reading the Comics Journal, and I'd read these editorials where I'm just discovering comics, and then you have these,
you're thrown into like the master graduate level of these guys,
right? Yeah. Where they're really telling you to evaluate yourself in the harshest light. Like, why are you doing, a lot of people were saying that in 1991, why are you doing biography when you haven't done anything interesting? Yeah. A lot of people would throw that like accusation at Chester Brown. And then why are you doing superheroes but pretending like you're not, like doing them like through a sort of a weird arty lens? And that absolutely paralyzed me. Yeah. Because all I heard was the naysaying rules. The same way that when you're in art school and you get a negative crit, it really penetrates. So that kind of paralyzed me, where I was like, well, I wanted to do both of those things. And I was like, well, I'm being told both of those things aren't worth doing by somebody who's writing a brainy editorial in the Comics Journal. And then 10 years later, I see, I remember picking up Jeffrey Brown, and I'm like, well, he's doing both of those things. So was Ron Rage's Spider-Man comic. Absolutely blew me away. I'm like, these guys are just doing what they want with this medium. So eventually I came back into it, but it was a very messy process of one step forward and 20 paces back.
Mm-hmm. And deciding, ultimately focusing on comics versus, we'll say, fine art. I get the impression you could have veered one way or the other. Yeah. Decided I'm going to be an artist, not exactly a cartoonist, or, fusing those.
I pursued doing gallery work.
That's a good way to put it too. Yeah, that fine art. But go on. Yeah.
I hustled after a gallery career during my 30s, and I discovered that I really didn't particularly like a lot of the personalities in the gallery system. I hated the process of going and renting a truck or whatever to take your paintings over, or strapping them to a car and paying, if you did a drawing, because I was doing work on big pieces of paper, paying to have them framed, and then they're hanging on a gallery, and then you're like, they're a little bit in a vacuum, you're not de Kooning. It isn't like people are coming from across the city to see your work, like you're this new art sensation. And that's all fine. There's some of that in comics too. But what I say to my students is that my heart's big enough to deal with the bullshit of the business of comics, the personalities of editors and publishers, and things like that you deal with. The publisher I'm with now is great, but there is a lot of the day-to-day business that's boring and you don't have control over. And I deal with that because I love comics so much, but I can't do that and also deal with the personalities of the gallery world. My heart isn't big enough to deal with that. So I've cut that out. And I still would like to have stuff on a wall somewhere though. But for the last 10 years, I definitely wanted to compartmentalize and just work on comics.
What size? When you're working on comics pages, what size?
Portable. Right now I'm working on about a 10 by 15 inch live space, and it tends to be in that area. I did briefly did 25-inch high pages because Klaus said that he did that in his late work.
Everybody has those things. Talking to Carl Stevens or somebody else who'd mentioned, maybe it was Carl, that he uses a Hunt 102 because like somebody mentioned this nib 30 years ago in the Comics Journal, so I have to use this, and has used that from there on, just because this is something that, as we saw when you're 19 years old reading the journal at that time,
it really penetrates.
Yeah.
The earliest things that you hear stick with you for a long time. So you got to be careful as a teacher what you tell students.
You also have that line in the book, the more damage, the more you remember. It's not in that same context, but like you say, the negatives also just really burn themselves in.
Okay, right here we had to take a little bathroom and coffee break, so there's a jump. It just doesn't sound organic, so I'm putting this part in instead. Sorry.
Tell me what you learned from teaching.
Oh, yeah.
And when you felt qualified to teach.
Well, that's good, both good questions.
Not just credentialed, but actually,
Oh, yeah.
that you had, you weren't cheating people in the process.
I answer the latter part first. Wait a minute. Yeah, latter. The qualified, when I first started teaching, I was at SVA and I thought that teaching, I was desperate to have work. Have something be functional in any way, and as somebody can make money. And I was so bad at every job I'd done up until then, or I was okay at it, but it wasn't anything that made any kind of money. I worked at a movie theater for years in LA, and I would. I'd do really long shifts if they needed me to. I'd stay after, all those things. But best you could make. It was a struggle to make even like $240 a week there. So so I think I would have made teaching work no matter what, because it seems like such a privileged job to do. Yeah. You're engaging with art. It's fun. You're thinking about this thing that you want to do when you get home, as opposed to a job where you tell yourself you're going to draw when you get home, and instead you're just worn out and you've been so disconnected. You've compartmentalized so hard that to get out of the compartment, you want to just watch TV or something, and then you go to sleep and then you do it again. Instead, you're all jazzed up from talking about comics, and you're working on them on the train, and then you get home and you still work on them for another hour and a half, and then you go to bed. So when I felt qualified was, I told a teacher, a watercolor teacher at SVA, and he said, okay, when you teach your first semester, you're going to be bad at it. And then the second semester, you're going to try to compensate for being bad, and you're going to make a bunch of mistakes by overcorrecting, and then you'll get your balance, which is a way oversimplification and a super binary way to think about how you work, but it was absolutely true at the same time. No matter how many ways I tried to say that's not going to be true. That's that guy.
No, I'm better than that.
Yeah. You fuck up. And I took a class this week, actually. I had Wednesdays off, and I signed up for what I thought was a writing comedy class by this alternative comic who I follow, and they did such a bad job. Mm-hmm. And it was such a waste of time class. But then I look back on it, and I was like, I probably did that my first semester. Probably had one day where I just tried to sound smart and forgot to give them a lesson, and tried to talk about the most profound elements of the work that we can possibly conceive of, and how, dualistic principles and negating things and whatever. And it was exactly like that, to the point where I managed to write the people who hosted the class and very politely say, I thought this was going to be more of a skill building thing, and I got to drop out, and I'll respect whatever decision you make, but I love it if you could give me back the money for the remaining two classes. And they said, we don't normally do this, but we will. And so I definitely screwed up, and it was a while before I felt like I had something to offer and I was qualified. But again, to anybody out there who wants to build up a teaching practice, if you're like me and you feel like you're just imminently fireable in every other job. And you have something to offer. What I would tell friends I tried to get hooked up with teaching gigs early on was, you don't need to know everything. You need to know more than the person you're teaching. Yeah. So that when you're coming in, like my early jobs were teaching how to beginning drawing and continuing ed. And that was fantastic. That was really rewarding. I thought, oh boy, we're gonna have to fake this. I don't know how I'm going to get into teaching people how to draw bottles, uncut, a still life with a bunch of like cylinders on it. Teaching people how to do cylinders is really interesting, because discovering like what they do wrong and how they refuse to see the foreshortened shape that is under the bottles is so rewarding, because people tend to be, only if they're real basic, they'll want to do a straight line or they'll want to do a square. They won't do anything in between, and that's kind of a profound idea. It's teaching people how to do the spectrum of shapes and really showing what's there and understanding drawing that little sliver of space of the extremely foreshortened table is actually doable and really rewarding. So that's it. A bit by bit, I learned more that I had something to offer. Where you hit a wall as a teacher early on is you'll get somebody who actually is more technically skilled than you. And that is very humiliating in the early days, because you're like, I don't know, man, can you teach me?
Yeah, I've got nothing to show you. Yeah.
Now when that happens, it doesn't faze me. And starting at Parsons, I was like, holy shit, I'm a very crude artist. How am I going to teach these kids who come in who already are very refined? You'll have a kid coming from a school in another country where they've actually drilled basics into them already. Now what am I going to do? Now, that doesn't faze me at all. And I proved to the kids pretty quickly that I have something to show them. I think of it as being, you got like Mickey and Rocky, he can't beat up Rocky, but he can actually teach him something.
So that's great.
As a technician.
Again, going back to our 70s roots, but yeah.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Make you a better artist?
Oh yeah. In every way, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, every now and then I'll hear people who will say, the teaching is taking too much away from my art, and, eventually maybe, like I said, I've cut down on one class so that I'm not teaching 7 days a week. Other than that, it has a good effect rather than a bad effect.
Mm-hmm. Within comics, do you remember the first real cartoonist you met?
Milton Caniff.
Yeah. Mine was Panter.
Really? How old are you?
25. At the licensing fair at the Javits Center, which I was covering for a trade magazine. And I'm there to interview like Sony and Disney and all these people. And then they had all these little booths for other companies and people who were licensing stuff. And I turn a corner and see Gary Panter, LLC. And I was like, holy fuck, Gary Panter. He jumps like I'm about to serve him with papers or something, for a subpoena. But, I was like, a huge fan of Jimbo. Oh my, what are you doing here? And we ended up spending 4 hours, 2 days, both afternoons. So I just sat with him at the booth, left whenever anybody came by to discuss project with him. But yeah, he was, of all people, the first cartoonist I ever spent time with. And it was a very strange experience.
1996 then, right?
Yeah. It would have been, I started fall 95. So 96 was the licensing fair I went to. And that was, I'll tell you some stories off mic about that stuff. But tell me about Caniff.
Oh, so, I was 11, and it's Columbus, Ohio, and Caniff had a big, he was a big part of the institution of Ohio State University. Mm-hmm. I think it was a two-way street back in earlier eras when he was on the cover of Time magazine. He was one of the more important figures in American culture. And by the time it was the 80s, he did the same chalk talks that he had been doing since the 40s up until he ended his career. So my dad took me to see him, and I didn't get it at all. To me, meeting Milton Caniff, the guy who did Steve Canyon, was like meeting the guy who did Mary Worth, or Rex Morgan, MD, or Mark Trail. Like they were
square.
Yeah. And their comics were like just a huge mass of content that I had no idea I had no idea about why anybody would read it. So then years later, I grew to absolutely adore Kniff, and I'm so happy that I met him. Still don't think Steve Canyon was as good as Terry and the Pirates, but nobody does, you know. But you can still learn a lot if you don't read it and you just look at the images. Steve Canyon's really cool looking. So yeah, he was the first, but there was also another political cartoonist who talked before him. So I guess he would have been the first. And actually the guy who did Dondi, whose name I used to know.
Yeah, I met the guy at a tiny little con a few miles from my home. Tom Spurgeon had mentioned, there's one in Riverdale, New Jersey. I'm like, what the fuck? Okay, it's 10 miles from here. Went there, met the guy who did Wildcat, the guy who did Dondi, and Rick Parker and a few other people. I'm like, not my world, but it's kind of neat to see some old timers. Joe Staton was there, which was one of those. Man, I was reading like E-Man in 1978, and I never quite thought about you as an actual human being, with all the Green Lantern strips and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, the weird things from our childhood that, it turns out people were actually making, I guess, is a strange aspect of comics,
It's,
But yeah, the Dondi guy. Sorry, go on.
I've been talking all morning, including with you, about how the difference between talking to people face to face, and it's the same thing with comics, like the difference between seeing comics as a physical object, like what that's like. I think one of the big push towards like becoming addicted to comics as, my adult life was seeing the 20th Century Comics Masters show. Mm-hmm. Did you ever see that?
No.
So the 20th Century Comic Book Masters, I think it was called, was a show that went from 1900 1950, and then 1950 to 2000. And to the 2000 stuff had like Panter and Art Spiegelman and Crumb, and the pre-1950 stuff had like Harold Gray and Chester Gould and Harriman and all the other
Winsor McCay, guys like that.
I was just about to say Winsor McCay, yeah. So seeing that on the wall was really, really different. It made me love Harriman like in a way that I never thought I would, because you're seeing all the original artists, and whenever you see that they actually used a razor, it gives you this little thrill because you're looking at all this refined work, and then you're seeing these savage lines.
There's always that thing. The first time people see whiteout.
Yes.
Somebody I had recently, I think it was Carl again, mentioned seeing whiteout on a great Bernie Wrightson Frankenstein print, and I was like, you had to correct things.
Yeah.
You weren't absolutely perfect. I have permission to make art now because I'm not going to be Bernie Wrightson with no flaws right out of the box.
I've heard that exact same story with Bernie Wrightson as an example.
I think it was Carl. It may have been a recent show I did, if you're an addicted listener of mine, but a lot of guys have those instances. For me, it was the same thing hearing an Elvis Costello demo of a song that I love the studio version of, realizing, you had multiple takes and multiple versions before you reach the thing that you actually want to release to the public. Now I understand. Again, Beatles, same thing. Like you're not perfect right out of the box. Things require work.
You know what I loved hearing recently? I was listening to a bunch of interviews with members of Fugazi.
Yeah.
And I think it was Guy was talking about, and I think it was on Rend It or some other very early Fugazi song where there's a drop where the music goes quiet and they start again. And apparently there's an early demo where the music all drops out and then Ian kind of like says the F word, and then they go into it, and they were discussing it, and I think Guy said that he was glad they left that out because it was kind of a gimmick.
Yeah.
And I can see both sides of it. That was such an illuminating moment, him talking about the authenticity of that moment, Yeah. But very similar, almost like seeing the whiteout.
And what audience perception means. This is something I wonder about with your work also. What your audience is, what you think of, how you're interacting with a reader, and what you as you're laying down the page, what it means, especially with the visual style that you use. Is the reader going to get what I'm doing? Are they seeing what I'm doing? Are they trusting me enough? as an artist to go through it. What was it like for you, I guess, sort of, again, hitting on the visual mode that you use and understanding what the audience is doing in the process of reading you? Not to make you too self-conscious about your work. I
don't think it will.
And he never made another page again after talking to Gil. Sorry, go.
I can't imagine you being a negative influence in that way.
Getting out of comics is a positive, not a negative. I'm just kidding. Go.
I think my big strategy when I started doing work was creating, doing adaptations and appropriating other people's characters, like Nancy when I did Suspect Device. Sure. That was a strategy towards making people look at my work, because I didn't think they'd look at it on its own. I didn't think I could make up a pastiche of a character that had the features of Nancy or something like that, or Rom. So I decided to just do there's that book Steal Like an Artist. I've never read it, but I get the gist. Where it's okay to appropriate. It's okay for rappers to take a sample and to build a new song out of it. So that was my big strategy as far as thinking about an audience, and it worked. I was able to talk to 5 people instead of talking to one person at a show, because they were like, "What's on your table?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm doing a adaptation of Rom," and definitely Suspect Device was so good, because then it was like I had 15 people, because they could skim through it and they could see my collaborators.
Yeah.
And that was a way of getting, inching my way towards an audience. Then as far as what I'm doing now, I started to see that people liked the stuff that wasn't leaning on stealing other characters.
Yeah.
And I could just go and still have some people come towards me. So that was fucking great. Aside from that, what can I answer a question?
I guess just that sense of an audience trusting you visually, and how much trust you have to put in the audience that they're going to get what I'm doing here, even if I'm fracturing, and again, that anti-narrative punk vibe, but you're still carrying them through almost 300 pages in this case of emotion, memory, and a lot of, difficult artistic approaches to, encompassing that stuff.
Well, I know what I don't like, So when I'm doing work, I won't name people, but I can think of the artists who absolutely are either too obscure or too freeform to the point where it's not interesting to me. In comics. I like story, so I just trust that. I just try not to do anything that is
deliberately obfuscatory is my term for deliberately obfuscatory. But you have these fractures and repetitions and such, but they carry. It's not like somebody goes down some odd stream of consciousness path that is only inside your own head. The artifice is there, even while the visuals seem to be this, I'll say, once again, throwing more terms at you, chaotic, and a sense of a swirl.
I almost wish that I know better than to like name names and bash people.
No, that's okay. Yeah.
Right? I wish I could, because there's some like,
we'll do that off mic.
Yeah, there's like one artist who's actually like really well liked, and their stuff is absolutely leaves me cold, for the reason there's such an there's such an intentional obscurity to like what they're writing. But it's funny. I'm having a flashback I did like a big Office binge like this last year. Did you ever watch The Office?
We finally did last year. Yeah.
There's an episode where Michael is like called to speak to David Wallace, the corporate manager, and they're asking like why he's successful, and he's so thrilled to be able to talk, and he's sitting there like and he asks him, he's like, "Can we get Dr. Peppers?" And he's like drinking drinking, and he goes, "Well, I have a philosophy, and it is, don't ever for any reason, no matter what, do anything to anybody that could be, and then they cut away and he's like, sometimes I just say sentences and see where they end up. And I hear myself doing that.
Yeah, the idea that his how-to book or his memoir was called Somehow I Manage was also one of those. Yeah, that does kind of sum it up. But yeah, it's well, again, stuff I've wondered about in relation to artists and what they how they try and get outside their own heads and understand an audience, but at the same time not pander. So I realize it's tough.
Well,
I do want to.
As far as not pandering, because I'm a teacher, I know that I can do work that is just what I want to do without trying to cater to an audience. Sure. I can do better. I can make like $100 in an hour of teaching. It would take me 8 hours of illustration. So I feel pretty stable, like having such a strong foundation of teaching. And then the work can just be like only guided by what this instrument in my chest tells me to do.
Yeah. Fine art influences. I wondered, there's a afterlife ghost sequence late in the book that had a very Philip Guston vibe for me.
Fuck yeah, thank you.
Okay,
I didn't think
I'm just
about
making sure, because that was one. They're not clan hoods that they're in, but they do have that Guston.
Oh, that thing, yeah,
thing going on.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I guess that was there. Even have the stitching on the outfits.
That was
at one
part
point.
of it. I was like, I'm seeing this. I don't know if that's his frame of reference, but
I looked at a lot of Harriman, and Harriman was influencing Guston a lot. But I look at fine art all the time. I was looking at somebody named, I'm forgetting now. It was, I look at a lot of WPA artists. Mm-hmm. I look at a lot of the people who, when I first started making art, I would be absolutely baffled at how they're able to do this. Harry Sternberg is one. He's not a super household name, but a really wonderful artist. And if you look at his drawings and his lithographs, there's like cross-hatching that is just like what the same kind of cross-hatching that any of the cartoonists that we love use as a foundation of their method. There's a love of ink that's not terribly different. There's a love of making up landscapes that's not terribly different. You look at the stuff and you're like, he wasn't looking at the city block or doing research. He made up what plausibly looked like an excavation pit here, and it's the same type of thing. So I look at one of the classes I teach is I have a Thursday morning class I've taught for 10 years where I started off as a museum class, and during COVID we went online, and I just have different slideshows that I'll present to my students, and every week I talk about the fundamentals of different drawing challenges. When I was younger, I remember looking at Jackson Pollock's work, and they're inevitably talking about what a crude artist he is. But I was saying, he's actually better on a technical level than I was at the time, even though he was like the failure of Thomas Hart Benton's class. It's actually, he's trying to battle it out with creating gradations and deal with light versus dark and creating volume. And it's kind of fascinating because you can find figure studies he did where he would abandon them in the middle. If you do a deep dive, you'll find these amazing kind of modernist influenced but representational figure studies that he did, and he always will just stop in the middle. Some artists have that look on purpose, like Carol Tyler. She has a lot of phantom shapes, or at least she used to. Yeah. No, she still does it. Yeah. Where if she just wants to stop, draw the character's hand and have everything else be resolved, she'll do it. So there's a big Venn diagram between the artists that are the lifeblood of this community and fine art.
Speaking of Carol, this spring you went to the ink farm that she has in Kentucky, and did some journal comics with Tom Hart and Carol. Tell me about the experience. Tell me why you went, and what you did, and what you found about yourself or your art.
Well, first of all, I love Tom Hart to death, and I would do anything he asked me to do. Yeah. So when he asked me to do it, I was like, I'll make a commitment to this for sure. I was like, I'll come out, I'll fly out, and I'll put things aside to do it. And then I met Carol. I loved Carol already. I loved her work. I've been seeing her stuff since 1988, 89 when I saw it in Weirdo. And really opened up her home to us. And the idea was that we were going to be like pulling up, literally like digging up posts or things buried in her yard. I had a torn rotator cuff muscle, so I could do only so much. But just being around her and Tom was awesome. And the hope is to turn that place into some kind of, a place where artists can do residencies and things like that through SAW. So that's kind of a dream, but we'll see where that goes. So while we were there, I think Tom pitched the idea to the Comics Journal of us collaborating, and I was all about that too. So what you saw is the result of us collaborating, partially because my rotator cuff was hurt. I think I did more than I really was able to draw a lot more than I was able to work. So I ended up spearheading it. I think the first 2 pages or first 2 days of that 5-day journey, I think it's like 80% me. And then I took the work home with me back to Hyena's house where I was staying, and because it ended up coinciding that I was with her for a month in Kentucky, and then Carol's in Kentucky, so ended up just being something that I was already in that part of the country for.
Yeah. Ask as a side question, 2 cartoonist relationship?
Oh yeah,
because as Carol and Justin show in the documentary, but kicked off SPX week, not always fruitful. Having 2 cartoonists in the same household. Yeah. I know you, from what I gather, not knowing anything about your life or relationship, it seems, Kentucky, New York. But after the documentary at the bar here at SPX, a number of cartoonists discussed whether they've ever dated other cartoonists or been in relationships with them. Talk about the 2 artist vibe as opposed to artist and non-combatant as we call it.
Non-combatants. I've dated civilians before, and it's pretty great. You don't have to, the amount of shared, the amount of commonality and stuff that we share. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of the other women I've dated have been like me, like kind of like very emotional punk rockers, and it is and they would want to understand me isolating and doing the comics and love that as much as I did, but we were worlds apart. So we would there would be a lot of I'd always have to remind myself, just hang out with this person, just pet their cat and have dinner, and but I'd always be leaving the other part of my life behind, and I would be like, well, this is what people do, you don't relate on every single level. But with Hyena, we do relate on every single level, and so it's really cool. It makes it a lot easier to disconnect the moment. Well, first of all, she'll accept it if we're having like a gluten-free pizza night and I'm still working on my comic at the same time. She will embrace that, and
let you prioritize the art, because she gets what it means to prioritize the art for herself, right?
Yeah. And hopefully, she sees I'm prioritizing being there with her having pizza as well. So she understands I carry this with me all the time, and I understand she does too. When, she'd probably do best to talk about this, with me. Like someday I'd like us to do one of these interviews together.
Couples therapy. I'm just kidding. Although I am apparently people's therapist, as I've discovered this weekend. A lot of people have had to talk to me about significant things in their lives that they don't want me to discuss with anyone. I'm like, okay, I'll be that guy.
All right. Hyena's actually, I think she could have another career as a therapist.
Yeah.
She's really good at advice. She's really good at doing why do you think this is happening, Mom? What do you think is behind this kind of line of questions? She's awesome.
Yeah. Back to the ink farm, drawing in a rural environment versus the urban that you're, again, there's Columbus, but then LA and New York, very, very city life for you. weird being in a farm and drawing and trying to get something from a very different physical environment than you're accustomed to?
Yeah. No, I think I have enough of the city stored up in me.
Okay.
I found it, I found it pretty peaceful, and maybe that would change my art over time. I know that there's artists who their work changes. David Sedaris, like his art definitely changed after he went from being a struggling, middle class person living in an urban wasteland of America to being happy living with his boyfriend in I don't remember what country, but there was a real drop off in how much I connected to his work at that point. And just another cartoonist who's so maybe maybe if you're in a rural area, it'll utterly change you eventually. But during just a couple weeks, it was just another table to sit in, and I still watched like the finale of Succession while I was there.
Yeah, it comes up in the in the journal, as I recall.
Oh, it does?
Yeah, there's a little caption, watching finale of Succession off in the background. But
yeah.
It may have been one of Tom's panels instead of yours, but yeah, it's I just wondered that sense of different environment for you and what it means again to have stuff in your head versus what the external stimuli is. I realized we never quite got to the question or answered it. Did Unended change your understanding and relationship with the memory of your old man?
No, I don't think so. It was a process working and dredging up like memories from the past. It would trigger a lot of memories, but in a way that I've always had that experience, like a lot. It would sometimes be annoying. I'd think about one thing I don't want to think about, and it would lead me to thinking about another thing I don't want to think about. And, but not to the point where it was debilitating or anything like that. And, I think the most profound change I've had was probably after doing the book. And I was talking to somebody about it, and it was what I said before about having empathy for him being a parent, and having to give up his this dream of being a writer, or struggling to maintain it. I think that, a lot of the process of doing the book was like, why couldn't he just get it together? Why couldn't he just, he seemed to be this guy who really wanted to shake his fist at the world and use art as a catharsis. And why get all but 10% of it done? And, what did change, I think, was all the times where I said to Hyena Hell, like, it's black or white, just fucking do the work. And there's a big sequence in the book where she's like, there's this factor and this factor and this factor that make it a state. It's not just about either do it or don't for everybody. Some people have massive financial stresses. Some people have debilitating health issues. Some people have mental health issues. Some people have all three of those things that conspire to burden them with so much depression that it's hard for them to function. And she articulates it better than I am here, but that was a late addition to the book, and it's almost word for word what she said, because I kept on consulting her, that changed me. I think the process of dating her for 8 years has made me see the world in black and white a lot less. And the funny thing about that is when that conversation, that page, which is all her, I have her say, I think the conversation is I say, what the fuck, just do it or don't. And she goes, okay, Rollins, here. And then she breaks it down.
The Rollins line I did laugh over.
It's a funny line, right? But she didn't say it.
Yeah.
I say that she said it.
It's
but
good.
now we say that to each other all the time. And when we say it's an okay Rollins moment, we know like what the other person means. But it sounds like something she would say so much. That really encompasses the way that she sees me and the way that we have this shared shorthand between each other.
Yeah. I'll put it.
Okay, Rollins should be a T-shirt. Like, like okay, Boomer.
Yeah, you've got the black flag shirt now. You may as well just Do you forgive your father? And that could predate the comic. And I don't know if forgiveness is even a concept of how you dealt with your family or your upbringing and dynamic, but and not to get all Oprah therapeutic, but
right. I don't know if I'm ready to answer that. And not that it's private. I really don't.
That's what I wonder whether it's yeah. And if you haven't, you haven't.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm about to go back into therapy, and I saw a therapist for years that my brother actually paid for. I didn't have any money back then, and my oldest brother Sam, and which really changed my life. But I haven't seen her for years. I started to, when I talk about getting all these goals together. I mentioned it earlier. The therapy led me to get on Wellbutrin, and Wellbutrin led me to be able to functioning led me to get a license so I could drive in LA, and getting on Wellbutrin helped me lead me to take the steps to get back in school, and getting back in school led me to my career. So once I did all that, the therapist was, we didn't really have a lot more to say to each other, but my cousin's a therapist, and I asked her advice recently, and she again asked one of those probing, like, what do you think is underneath this kind of questions, which led me to consider going back into therapy. So I have medical coverage. I have insurance through being at school, working at one of my schools. And I found out that I actually can talk to counselors, and now everybody's doing counseling online. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I actually just talked to somebody the other day, and my cousin recommended them. I think they know of them or something. And she was like, I hope you can talk to this person. And I had checked the person out, but it said clearly on their site, we don't take insurance. And so I wrote her and I said, she doesn't take insurance. And it says multiple times on her site, she doesn't take insurance. And by the way, her house looks like a punk house, because underneath her had her name on her little, what do you call it, your signature? Yeah. Email. I had her address for some reason. And when it came up, it looked like a punk house, if everybody knows what I mean by that. And I thought that was really funny, but neither here nor there.
We have a house down the street from us we refer to as the meth lab, but yeah, I get the vibe. So
yeah. And my cousin's like, that should be a plus for you. I was like, well, absolutely, but she doesn't take insurance. And anyways, I think it's just incidental. It's just a house. Yeah. And punk houses just look like every other house, but yeah. She turns out she does take insurance. And then I talked to her very briefly. We did a consult, and I liked her. I liked the way she was responding to me kind of laying out my situation. So, but probably it has a lot to do with how empty I did end up coming up at the end of doing this process, which is what I expected. My therapist used to say, there's certain things that are never going to go away that you grew up with, that they're not going to be better. You're just going to live with them. Yeah. And I think I'm still there. I still will, but in general, I'm trying to forgive everybody in my life. I'm trying to get to a place where I'm just not internalizing a lot of resentment. And it's really, when I tell people shit that I represent about other people, it often sounds kind of stupid, or either it's not that big of a deal, or I sound really shitty for carrying it around all these years. So I like that. That's something I get out of therapy. And it also shows me not just that I shouldn't feel these things because it's not a good look, but actually I feel better if I see it in that.
Yeah, I had a big realization this summer that I act like a monster around my old man. I know why I do it, but it was the realization that I don't like feeling like a monster.
Right.
And being an asshole around him. I have to change. He's not going to change. I have to change how I'm responding to these things, and just have the guilt. Don't let 50 years of this ongoing thing affect you anymore. Just smile.
Do you snap? Do you get like petty or petulant?
Yeah. And I'm the one with power now because he's an old man who's in heavy decline. And that's he's 86 years old. But that's when he had power, he did neglectful as opposed to abusive behavior. And it's that realization that, like, who you are is what you do when you're in a position of power. And it's I don't need to be an asshole to prove I can, there's nothing to win, at this point. And you know that stuff intellectually.
But it's really hard, though.
But yeah, trying to integrate that and feel it once again in the heart was one of my things this summer. And we know everything is an ongoing battle to make sure you're staying ahead of that stuff and not letting the, pettiness creep in, or the, as you put it in the book, that and something Philip Lopate talks about in the cardinal sin of personal essays. Getting revenge is not the goal of a personal essay or memoir or autobiography. And
it'll probably make the art worse.
Yeah. And you show it in the book. I mean, you have this would just be me, and you have the critique of your own work in the process. Like, well, this is just me trying to get back at my father, and there's no point in doing that. So I was very happy to see that sort of stuff, as opposed to I'm going to get revenge on my old man and show his art was never any good, But yeah, now it's me prattling on about that sort of stuff when I should be asking. Community. There's the teaching that you do, but does the community of either cartoonists or other people in your life help? What does it mean, I guess, to have a community that you belong to, or do you feel that you belong?
Yeah, especially here, we're at SPX is a good place to contemplate that. There's lots of benefits, both big and small, and things to observe, both big and small, from having a relationship with your community. There's a lot of, time goes really quickly. So you see, people who are, people go from being in their 20s, being in their 30s, people like me going into being in their 50s, people go, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of dealing with the community can be really healthy, kind of put you in your place. I saw Mike Dawson recently wrote a comic where he said comics have a short memory, so as an older artist, you're constantly reintroducing yourself to a younger audience. I thought that was really well put, because that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Going into a room where one person is telling you that you're meaningful and your work is validating your work, and going into another room where they have no idea where you are, I've always welcomed that. Yeah. I think I read I read a piece of writing that Henry Rollins wrote about that years ago, where he's like, I'm in this band and people are screaming my name, and then he was trying to audition for the movie Weeds. Wait, not Weeds. Yeah, it was a Nick Nolte prison movie. Yeah. And he almost was cast in it. Which I always thought was a fascinating story, because he would have been in a movie like in 85 instead of in the Chase in 96 or whatever. But he said,
forgetting Johnny Mnemonic from like 93 or 94. But anyway, go on.
Yeah.
And nobody knew who he was in terms of casting?
Yeah, he's like, those guys had no idea who I am. And he's like, and actually I had the same thing happen. My brother's a video director, and he had me he's doing a Melissa Etheridge video, right? And I was looking at the casting tapes, because he was like, can you do this for me? Because, help out around here. And Harley Flanagan from the Cro-Mags walks in. He was living in LA, and he walked into audition for like a tattooed punk guy in the background. And I was like, it's fucking Harley Flanagan. But that was very much my LA experience. Nobody was like, oh, who's that? That's
that guy. Yeah.
Nobody in LA. In LA in the 90s, somebody asked me recently about what it was like my relationship was with LA punk. And I was like, coming out to LA in 94 was like, I lived in Columbus, and places like, the Anti-Club and the Hong Kong Cafe were legendary. And then you go out and they're just still around, and nobody was like, this is where the Germs played. They're just a place where, like, Bikini Kill played at the Hong Kong Cafe. And I think they probably did it because of that place's history. Nobody else was playing there. Yeah. I went to go see Greg Ginn at the Anti-Club, and that's a place which is owned by E.G. Daly's mother, I believe. And it is like, it's like a legendary punk place. You always were talking to people who are like, they're understanding. They were just talking about whatever was on MTV that week.
Yeah, it's because a show of the week, whatever the current thing is, instead of all this history.
Yeah. And some of it was, I don't know, just people were just like that. They weren't weirdo, obsessive catalogers like me. So anyways, going back to, that quote about that Rollins said, I always thought about, though. He goes, I went in that room, they had no idea who I was, and that's a good thing, you know? But Rollins, in a lot of ways, had a horrible, had a horrible effect on me, because in his writing, he'd always just be like, I don't give a fuck who likes me and who doesn't. They can all go fuck themselves and die. I'm just going to do what I want. And if they come to me, they do. If they don't, they don't. But that's somebody who is very much, that view is resting upon the laurels of him riding the wave of the support and having achieved something. Yeah. And you can say also, that's a real pose that you can do. Like, you know, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to turn my back on the audience. You can do that when the audience is standing on their tippy toes to see you.
Yeah, I think Nick Cave had something like that. The documentary on Nick Cave from like 10 years ago, there's also we did this show back in the 80s with the Bad Seeds, and we all just went to the corner of the stage and wouldn't look at the audience, and they were just getting more and more pumped up and insane about it because we were doing this, but they were there to see them, and it's a very different vibe. So I've only discovered Cave very recently, so
really?
I'm in this. I knew him from Wings of Desire, but never knew where to start, and then watched 20,000 Days on Earth and kind of sort of building this theoretical thing about him as an artist and what his approach to art and spirit and change means about human beings and what we do. And I added him to the Mount Rushmore list of people I could someday sit down with to record. It would be wonderful, but
I mean, he's so. I mean, one of the reasons I would want to turn my back on people is because I can be pretty inarticulate and and it's a protection thing, Sure. It's better it's a little bit of a safety hatch. If I don't say anything at all, then I won't say anything stupid, or I won't say anything. I won't say anything that I don't know, against somebody else that comes back to haunt me, whatever that shows my ignorance about political issues, whatever. And Nick Cave doesn't have that problem. He's witty as fuck.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things I find is the willingness to say, yes, young Nick Cave would not have liked, this stance or that stance, but the point of living is that you change and grow and find that the spirituality aspect borders on religiosity, especially in the not memoir, but interview that Sean O'Hagan did with him, the book, Faith, Hope, and Carnage.
I'm reading that too.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And seeing someone who, maybe the roots were there, the seeds were there when he was young, the bad seeds. But seeing what that flowers into as one becomes, who they become in their 50s and 60s, and the losses we endure I've been thinking a great deal about him and his work, even though I don't have experience with the music very much. And it's one of those things where I have artists who I appreciate in theory as opposed to in practice. But again, this is me going off on one of my tangents. I should ask the great closing question, because we're getting on to SPX time. What are you reading?
It's a good question.
I usually warn guys in advance because people hate drawing a blank on that, but comics, prose, whatever.
That's a good question, because I'll have like 10, but I do a lot of audiobooks because I don't have enough time to read. I did pick up the new Three Rocks yesterday by
good.
by Bill Griffith, and I'm going to read that soon. I've been meaning to finish, speaking of stuff which is reading, it's not available as an audiobook, Full Graph by Zach Sally. I love his writing.
Yeah. He sent that to me. I haven't started. He's done a whole bunch of stuff so we can record, and I was like, I'm going to need to take time to read that. I don't want to, commit to something and then like rush through his comics and the prose. So but you're reading it now?
It's wonderful. It's like we talked about Rollins. It's like Rollins meets Kerouac, like that on the road kind of story. I've had that in 3 different editions. I've had 2 different versions of the mini chapters. I love the look of those books. And speaking of musicians, I love his album Fear of Song, Zach Sally. That is a kind of an unheralded masterpiece. And when I first got into that, I knew he had played with the low, and at the time, I love low now, but at the time I didn't. I was like, well, I wish low sounded like this, because it's actually it really has a lot of, it's kind of like rock, but it has the same kind of moody power. But now I love both of those bands. And then I have like 10 different audiobooks I'm simultaneously trying to get through. The last one I finished, I was very proud that I actually finished. I finished the Vietnam memoir just recently. Yeah. There's a bunch of free Vietnam audiobooks on Audible, and this one was called Nonsense, which is not a great name. No, right?
But still, yeah.
It's so clever that it's dumb. Yeah. And it was really interesting. It was very so well written that I thought it must be fiction. But I think it veers off into some kind of very reactionary, flights of fancy at times. Not at length. He just doesn't analyze some assumptions. He still talks about the Vietnamese like they're the enemy to a certain degree. Yeah. He kind of poo-poos like progressive movements. But that was actually a really readable book in a lot of other ways. And I read a book by one of the members of the Chicago 7. And he wasn't one of the famous ones, but I can't remember his name, but he actually ended up being a teacher at Rutgers. He wasn't convicted, I don't think, or he did very little time. That was my next project involves the Chicago 7. So I wanted to read it for research.
Okay. You did lead off by saying that you did have a new project that Unended is already behind you. So, you know, I always know not to jinx creators by asking what they're working on next. So I'm going to leave you to surprise me in a couple of years with another one. But,
all right, deal.
Because you're way too goddamn prolific. But again, you know the secrets of being prolific, just like me. No social life, no drinking, and no kids.
Yep.
So, get back to SPX. And Josh, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
And that was Josh Baer. His new book from Uncivilized Books is Unended, out just about now. It is a fantastic graphic novel / memoir. I hope we got across what it was in this book that really resonated with me and why it makes for such a good meditation on family and memory and art, and that Joan Didion maxim that we tell stories in order to live. So go give it a read, Unended by Josh Baer. And check out Josh's site, joshbaer.com, to find out more about his comics, his other appearances, and his teaching, especially both for schools and one-on-one. You can follow Josh on Facebook at Josh Baer and on Instagram at Josh M. Baer. Without the M, it's JoshBayer. Josh M. Baer is just like it sounds. I'll have links to all that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with really interesting conversations with fascinating people. And also let me know what you like and don't like about the show, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. You can do that by email, by DMing me if we're connected on social media, by sending me a postcard or a letter. My mailing address is at the bottom of the Substack I send out twice a week. You can also leave a message on my Google Voice number, and that's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go longer than that, just you'll get cut off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I would never include something like that without the speaker's permission. So leave me a message and let me know. If you got resources to spare, especially money, don't give it to me. I mean, I've got a Patreon. The Substack has a paid tier, although there's no paid content for it. It's just a way of supporting what I do in spirit. But really, just give to other people, give to other institutions. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and all those other crowdfunding platforms. And there are people who need help with medical bills or rent or veterinary bills or car payments, getting an artistic project off the ground. There are all sorts of things you can do to help people out. And when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign, Planned Parenthood. I make targeted election contributions because I'm a lobbyist and it helps me with my job, but you might also find some value in giving to politicians or to campaigns that you really believe in. So what I'm saying is, if you've got some resources, there are a lot of things you can do to help build a better world. So, I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.